Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to this AEI panel discussion on reconstructing Ukraine's infrastructure. My name is Rick Geddes, and I am a non-resident senior scholar at AEI. I'm also a professor in the new Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell, and jointly a professor of economics at Cornell. More to the point of today, I'm founding director of something called the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy, or CPIP. This event was co-sponsored by AEI and CPIP and was made possible with the help from the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, for which we are very grateful. The impact of Russia's war on Ukraine on that country's infrastructure is nothing short of mind-boggling. The types of infrastructure facilities damaged or destroyed in the war include roads, bridges, schools, kindergartens, hospitals, irrigation systems, generating and transmission capacity, airports, and railroads, among many others. The World Bank estimates that the cost to rebuild Ukraine after the war are about $411 billion, including $135 billion to repair direct damage to buildings and infrastructure to date, although my guess is the actual number is much higher. The effort to reconstruct Ukraine's infrastructure raises a host of tough policy questions. Will there be adequate funding, as distinct from financing, for Ukraine to complete the needed repairs and upgrades? Can Ukraine's infrastructure be made more resilient to future hostilities? Can Ukraine become a model for other countries and rebuild its infrastructure using cutting-edge developments in methane capture, carbon capture, sensors, materials, new types of concrete, and innovations that increase efficiency while reducing the environmental impacts of renovation? To my own interests, what is the potential role of private capital in reconstructing Ukrainian infrastructure? We have a very distinguished group of panelists here today to discuss these and other pressing and critical policy questions. Reading their full bios would require the entire afternoon, so I will only list their accomplishments briefly in the order in which they will speak. First will be Natalie Jaresko. Natalie is Managing Director in EY Parthenon's Turnaround and Construction Strategy Practice, where she is focused on the government and public sector. She will lead EY Parthenon's sovereign restructuring efforts and large-scale public sector turnarounds. She has over 30 years of transformational leadership in the public and private sector. Natalie served as Minister of Finance for Ukraine from 2014 to 2016, during an exceedingly difficult time in that country's history, when it was rocked by deep recession, Russia's initial occupation, and war. Natalie then served 5 years from 17 to 22 as the Executive Director of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. She led the sustainable exit from the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history while restoring the island's fiscal health. Earlier, Natalie spent 2 decades in private equity as CEO of Horizon Capital and Western NIS Enterprise Fund, both fund managers with over $600 billion under management. Natalie will be followed by Robert Zolik. Bob is Senior Counselor at Brunswick Group Geopolitical, an advisory service of Brunswick Group, and an adjunct professor and senior fellow at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. In addition, Bob serves on the boards of Temasek, Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund, and Robinhood Markets. He also chairs the International Advisory Council of Standard Chartered Bank and serves on the Strategic Council of Swiss Re. He is member of the boards of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Carnegie Endowment. He chairs the Global Tiger Initiative and is a member of the Global Leadership Council of Mercy Corps, a global humanitarian agency. Prior to that, Bob was president of the World Bank Group from 2007 to 2012, U.S. Trade Rep from 2001 to 2005, and Deputy Secretary of State from 2005 to 2006. From 1985 to 1993, Bob served as counselor to the Secretary of Treasury and Undersecretary of State, as well as White House Deputy Chief of Staff. More recently, he has published a new book called America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, which was published in August of 2020. His book has been translated into Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Georgian. Bob will be followed by Senator Rob Portman. Rob's career in public service spans 3 decades and includes serving in 3 presidential administrations, 2 terms in the United States Senate, and 6 terms in the United States House of Representatives. Bob is a distinguished visiting fellow in the practice of public policy here at the American Enterprise Institute. Rob served in 2 cabinet-level jobs in the George W. Bush administration, where I think we overlapped. He was Director of Office of Management and Budget and U.S. Trade Representative. During Rob's tenure in the Senate, more than 220 of his bills were signed into law by Presidents Joe Biden, Donald Trump, and Barack Obama. Our final speaker will be Matthew Murray. Matthew has engaged in countering corruption in high-risk nations for more than 30 years as a U.S. government official, human rights lawyer, NGO founder, business executive in extractive industries, and advisor to governments. His extensive experience includes public service as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and Senior Advisor at USAID during the Obama-Biden administration. Matthew is currently an adjunct professor at the Columbia University School of International Public Affairs. In Ukraine, Matthew is currently helping the government protect critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, while strengthening public procurement processes for acquiring the digital technologies to support e-governance and growth in the knowledge economy. So Natalie, why don't we start off with you? We'll have the panelists make their remarks. I also have a pad here that will allow me to monitor questions and comments from our remote audience today, and we'll hopefully have a lively discussion. Natalie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm honored to be here with such distinguished guests and with all of you. I'm going to give a general overview, just I think so that we have a common baseline for the rest of the discussion. I think it's important to note that we've entered the 10th year of this war. This war began in 2014 with the illegal invasion, occupation, and annexation of Crimea, then eastern Ukraine. And at that time, we used to say that the Russian authorities controlled, occupied 7% of our territory, which reflected about 20% of our GDP. Fast forward, we're entered into the 10th year of this war. And in this 10th year of the war, now over 400 days since the full-scale invasion in February of 2022, what's happened? I think we can break down the damage into several categories. First and foremost, human. I can't begin to tell you the human cost to Ukraine. So when we talk about reconstruction, that's not what we all think about initially, but it's something that we have to keep in the backs of our mind. 6 to 8 million people have turned to be refugees, forced to flee their homes to other countries, including the United States, which have opened their doors to them graciously. Another 3 to 4 million people are internally displaced, unable to go home because it's been destroyed entirely and or currently remains occupied by Russian authorities. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed, and we don't know the actual numbers because so much of the territory remains occupied. Today, 17% of the territory of Ukraine is occupied. At its height, it was over 20% early in the war. Thousands of children, many of you have heard about this, have been taken, kidnapped, moved, deported forcibly to Russia. The environmental damage is often not really focused on. And that environmental damage we should lead with mining. A third of the territory of this country has been mined. That's about the equivalent of the size of Austria having been mined. And this mining, of course, will affect how we move forward with reconstruction. There are areas of water table damage. There are areas of actual land, soil damage. If you can only imagine, when you think about all the ammunition and artillery that's being utilized, all of that wreckage remains on the territory of what was, what will be again, the leading grain exporter in the world. And then there's the physical destruction, which you reflected on the World Bank report. And all I can say is that if you think about over 150,000 residential buildings, over 3,000 institutions of education, over 1,200 healthcare facilities, all of this while over 7 million people have been pushed into poverty, we have now seen a destruction unknown in such a small period of time. And it's important to note that sometimes it looks on the press like there's a line, a front And that's where the danger is, and that's where the damage is. The damage is across the entire country. Every day there are missiles, drones, and bombs throughout the country. Every morning people awake not once, but 3, 7, 10 times a day to the security warnings that they need to go into their bomb shelters. And today, this is a war of attrition. And it's the economy that really is going to define who wins or loses. I know weapons, 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 and I know that you can't win a war without weapons. But all of this now is based on the economy being equally, if not more important to Ukraine's success. And there have been, I break down the financial needs of Ukraine into 3 categories. One is what I'll call sustainability. How do we maintain a government that can serve its people, that can provide the most basic essential services, whether that be pensions or subsidies to internally displaced people, or just paying the salaries, minimal as they are, of civil servants, doctors, emergency staff, teachers. That immediate budget support has a deficit of about $3 billion per month. So that's a need of about $36 billion per year that has been covered since the beginning of the war, primarily by the United States and the EU, together with other G7 countries. The United States is providing about $1 billion a month this year, and the G7 is committed up to $39 billion just for that. The second area is what I'll call recovery. Recovery is what you need to do today because you've liberated a territory, and all the bridges have been blown up, or bombs have destroyed an electricity generation facility, and you need electricity, and so you need to rebuild it, you need to repair it, and you need to do it now. The estimate for this year alone was, by the Ukrainian government, was about $18 billion. And so that recovery is going on today. And then there's the reconstruction that you hear a lot about, that people compare often to the Marshall Plan for Europe post-World War II, although it's the opposite. Here we had, in the Marshall Plan, we had 1 donor and 16, I think, recipients. Here we're going to have 1 recipient and hopefully many, many more donors be a part of it. And so how then do you look at that reconstruction long term? Well, long term, I think there have to be multiple sources, and I know there are experts on the panel who know more about specific sources, but I'll break it down into 3, 4 groups. 1, bilateral support. The United States is going to have to be there. Not because it's a moral duty, but because it's also in our interest as a country to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. It's in our interest to see a country that is on the path to EU accession, that maintains a strong democracy, that will have one of the biggest and strongest militaries on the European continent when this war is over. And it's important to our business sector to be an integral part of that rebuilding. But aside from bilateral support in the forms that it would normally take, USAID, Development Finance Corporation, all of the international institutions will have to come to the table. And that means all of the multilateral development banks. And we should go beyond the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and try and bring in the other multilateral banks. Bring in more of the world into this reconstruction. Third, I think the private sector itself has to be a very big part of this. If Ukraine is to build back and leapfrog as it intends, as it's drafted its plans, and technologically leapfrog from a climate and green perspective, only the private sector can bring that to the table. And finally, Russia needs to pay. And Russia needs to pay with whatever resources are available, starting with the frozen central bank reserves of Russia. But that should not be the end. That should only be the very beginning, because they have caused the destruction. I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll be able to talk some more about some of these elements.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you very much. Bob, we look forward to your remarks.
I want to thank you, Eddie, for the invitation, for all the work you've done on this. And it's a pleasure to be. Matthew's devoted much of his life to this. Rob has had this extraordinary career in both the executive and legislative side. But I tell you, even more important from what I watched is Ohio politics. He managed to build a political base there that was quite extraordinary under some challenging times. So he brings everything to this. And but I want to highlight Natalie most of all. We were talking. Natalie actually began as our first economic minister in Kiev back in 90, 91, 92 at the time of independence. But as I hope all of you know, she was truly a courageous and heroic finance minister, playing a key role in addition to helping Puerto Rico. So she's got quite a record on that. I think this event's particularly timely, Rich, and that's one reason I'm glad to participate, because as Natalie touched on, you can find a lot of debates, I'm certain, in the halls of AEI and others about tanks, APCs, whether we should have airplanes, artilleries, and missiles. That's all important, but at the end of the day, I suspect the economic campaign is going to be as critical for Ukraine's future as the military battlefield. As Natalie mentioned, this is a war of attrition, and wars of attrition depend ultimately on sort of capacity and will. Putin recognizes this. Look at what his attacks on infrastructure, economic capacity, and others. And I think while the US and the G7 and other friends of Ukraine have done a pretty good job on some of the supplies, I think they're behind the curve on organizing this sort of economic dimension. And the timeliness of this is next week, you've got the IMF World Bank meeting, so you've got the economic leaders of the world here in Washington. You've got the G7 summit later in May. So I think this is actually a very important time for the G7 and others to start to outline what the economic plan for Ukraine's success looks like. And I'll just touch on 6 points to sharpen this. The first one Natalie's already mentioned. Some people think, oh, well, you can't begin reconstruction until the war is over. That's a huge mistake. And Natalie used the three-part structure that I think it was the European Center for Policy Reform sort of first came up with. While she emphasized the first stage of survival, about the $3 billion a month, what I also want to kind of emphasize on that is the IMF has just come to an accord with the central bank and the Ministry of Finance in Ukraine to try to finance this without an inflationary explosion. So it's really important that we get the follow-through on this. On the fast recovery, what I want to add to what Natalie's mentioned, she talked about the huge displacement of people. So a lot of, frankly, women and children have left Ukraine. If those people are away for how many years, will they come back? You have to be able to have the capacity for shelter, schools, basic medical facilities. So that's why fast recovery is important. And I would include on that some of the private sector. There was an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about the Ukrainian grain business that was kind of on the edge of bankruptcy and survival. That also has to be in the fast recovery. And then you've got the longer term reconstruction issues. Second point, in undertaking this, it's critical to keep an eye on your strategic aim. And the strategic aim for Ukraine's success and future is to become a member of the European Union. And this is not just kind of the long haul that you see in some of the Balkan countries. It has to be a serious sort of ongoing effort. This is not only a question of economics, it's also a question for national security, because Russia's not going to go away here. And so if you're going to have a successful economy, it has to be sort of built into the security structure of Europe. Third, how do you best organize the support? So Natalie mentioned you got the World Bank, you got the IMF, you got the EBRD, you got the European Investment Bank, you've got bilateral support and others. And they're all going to bring various types of capacity as well as the work that USAID is doing. So how do you coordinate this in partnership with Ukraine? And there's various options. If you go back to that strategic point, you clearly want it linked to the future with the European Union. But I think it would be a mistake to simply hand this over to the European Commission, both because of the bureaucracy, and as Natalie mentioned, you want the rest of the world, you want the G7 and others sort of part of this process. One model that we talked about a little bit on our phone calls was in the Marshall Plan, the ECHO was created as a standalone unit to try to coordinate the Marshall Plan support, and it actually went out of business, which is sort of an unusual, but it may be a model that you want to try to look at here, which is a way of trying to keep G7 support. Now, there are other variations. The World Bank has coordinated assistance across other donors, but this is one of those issues where you want to keep the political leadership, particularly in the G7, closely involved because it's a political economy sort of security issue. Fourth, development reconstruction will never work unless the locals own it. So you have to create the appropriate partnership with the Ukrainians. That partnership has to be transparent and accountable because you've got past challenges we all are aware of with oligarchs and corruption and rule of law issues. And as Rob would probably know, Congress and donors, they're going to insist on this in one form or another. However, and Natalie is, in a sense, exhibit A on this, people need to recognize Ukraine's made great progress on this. And frankly, the war itself has brought out the strength of civil society and brought out sort of the underlying aspects of Ukraine's strength that I think can be part of this structure. The World Bank and others have learned a lot about how you can use e-procurement systems and others to have transparency on these issues. You can link them with civil society so that they can participate and catch things that are going wrong. And one that I think people need to look seriously at, and Natalie would have a better view, a lot of the economics has been centralized in Ukraine. And at least from what I pick up, in some of the cities, there's going to be a desire for decentralization, sort of more local control on some of these issues. And one other one that Natalie and I have talked about is, given uncertainties about the court system, might you consider some sort of a transitional court system? You've got this incredible Ukrainian diaspora, not only in the United States, but in Canada and elsewhere. Maybe some of these people could come in for 5 or 10 years in some sort of judicial or magistrate system. Remember, Hong Kong, before it got reabsorbed, actually had foreign lawyers as part of its overall system. But so how you create this partnership is going to be critical. Fifth, private sector development. The first point I want to emphasize is this is not only a future issue. As Natalie mentioned, you've got sort of one of the world's most important agribusinesses in Ukraine now. We have to figure out ways to keep that going, whether it's guarantees, liquidity support, and others. Most likely, foreign investors are going to look for various types of public sector support. And here, one has to look at flexible use of instruments. There's been some experience. When do you use equity? When do you try to use sort of mezzanine financing? How about guarantees? Various types of risk insurance. I think people have to adapt about this. But again, just look at Ukraine today. Look at its strengths with information technology, its entrepreneurialism. There's a whole possibility here for small and sector, medium-sized industries. And of course, part of this can be part of an energy transition with Ukraine as well. Sixth, and sort of final point, and Natalie mentioned this, is that the G7 needs to be moving now on the transfer of approximately $300 billion of Russian official sovereign assets to Larry Summers, Phil Zelikow and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post on March 20th trying to outline some of the legal and economic aspects. So I won't go through all of it now, but there's actually precedents that were done with the Gulf War with Iraq. The international law is pretty clear. My guess is that domestic legal support, frankly, I think you could do this under current domestic IEPA authority, but if Congress wants to sort of further endorse it, that's fine too. The EU has commissioned an effort to start to look at this, but you'll find lawyers, and this is what lawyers do, will quibble and quarrel and all their different aspects of it. This is where Rob would also have a view. It's very hard for me to conceive that the American Congress or public, or frankly Europeans, are going to agree to give that $300 billion back to Russia. So why not try to use it? And by the way, if we ever reach a point where you can have a settlement, maybe some of that can be used in the overall settlement context. So to close, I just want to step back and thank AEI because, as I said, I think this is really one of those critical moments. It's important to recognize the connection of the economics and the security agenda. So for all the debate on the artillery and tank systems and others, pay attention to the economics because I think that's going to determine the long run. We've got some very important questions of timing and sequencing. And the critical point is you can't wait until the fighting ends. And if I close with one other historical analogy, the Bretton Woods Conference, many of you are familiar with, took place in 1944 before World War II ended, and people were starting to think about what followed. In this case, I think it's also key to the success of Ukraine being able to win the ultimate strategic victory as a democracy and a sovereign country connected and part of the EU, but it's also going to be critical for its long-term reconstruction.
Thank you, Bob. Terrific. Senator Portman, we look forward to your thoughts.
Well, Rick, first, thank you for organizing this, and to our friends at Cornell, Richard and others, for partnering with AEI. You are the bridge between AEI and Cornell.
Infrastructure.
You know, I was just thinking as Natalie and Bob were talking, we were on this stage about 3 weeks ago talking about the military side of this equation and the need for us to provide more weapons more quickly to Ukraine so that there could be a military victory. Because success on the battlefield, as well as tightening sanctions and having them work more effectively, obviously is key to getting to a more peaceful Ukraine where there can be the opportunity for real reconstruction. So we can't forget that part of it. As Bob has said, that has tended to be the focus, understandably. That's sort of the necessary next step. But at the same time, we have to start preparing for that eventuality, and in the meantime, continuing to work on restoration. I've been to Ukraine about a dozen times since 2014. My most recent visits, a few times since the most recent invasion of February of last year. You see the restoration happening. You know, I was at bombed out electric generation stations. The missiles had hit only 5 or 6 days before we were there, and already the systems were back up and going. And it's extraordinary to see what's happening. Some of it is from equipment that's on the shelves and able to move very quickly. Some of it is coming from the United States, the Europeans, and others. Some of it is Soviet-era equipment, so it's hard to find it. But the point is, the Ukrainians are so resourceful. And we see this on the battlefield, but we also see it in terms of these restoration efforts that are already beginning. But that long-term restoration is absolutely essential. President Zelensky has said on a couple of occasions when I have been with him, we need your economic help, but what we really want is your help to stop these missiles. Because until we can stop the missile attacks, it's impossible for us to get some of the Ukrainian displaced persons who are all over the world, mostly in Europe. Natalie talked about 6 to 8 million people. Get them back and get them back into productive small businesses and getting the economy moving again. Remember, their economy is off by 40% at least. And Natalie may have some insight into that, but I think those numbers may be generous. By the way, the Russian economy has only decreased their GDP by 4 or 5% probably. Although I think the sanctions are starting to tighten, and that's important. So I guess the first thing I would say is the military side is incredibly important because I think unless you have battlefield victories, it's hard to stop that. And incredibly important that we have these Patriot missiles that are now arriving and other better ways to defend the country against these missile attacks. Second point, I think Bob did a really good job of laying out kind of the structure of how we should think about where we are. And Natalie did a great job on putting us on perspective and just the heartbreak of what's going on in Ukraine today. But I do think it is, without question, going to require a lot of private investment to get Ukraine back on its feet. And in a sense, again, this is a heartbreak that this is necessary. It's also an exciting opportunity in some respects to be able to bring expertise from around the world into the hands of Ukrainians who are incredibly resourceful, as I said, and sophisticated in so many of these areas. So resiliency, building resiliency into these new projects. Rick, you've talked about more elastic versions of concrete as an example being used to ensure that these infrastructure projects last longer and are perhaps resilient to a longer war. We've talked about the need for sustainability and the new technology that can be used to ensure that there's ongoing maintenance and not just the construction of infrastructure as we've seen in our own country. I was the Republican author of the infrastructure bill, some of you know, but the longer term maintenance needs. So we don't get in a situation where there's so much deferred maintenance. And then on the green side, there's obviously a lot of opportunities here for this to be developed in a way that's consistent with where the Ukrainians would like to go long term. So all of this is really important, but without the private sector, I don't see it happening. And so what does private sector investment require? I think two things primarily. One is the public investment. And we've talked about the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. We talked about the IMF and the World Bank. Bob, by the way, a former president of the World Bank, if you didn't hear that. So he has a lot of experience there. Former finance minister here from Ukraine. So they've worked with all these international organizations. But I think that from our perspective here in this country, we need to be ready, and we're not, with regard to our own institutions. So as an example, here in the United States, we have a relatively new institution to try to ensure that companies that are willing to make investments overseas have the kind of security and guarantees and insurance to be able to operate effectively. That's called the DFC. It really has not been as effective, in my view, as it could be, but it's a great idea. It takes the old OPIC and other institutions and entities and tries to create this new opportunity. We need to be ready. The Europeans have had 3 conferences already. There's a 4th conference being planned in the UK, and that's good, and they're moving ahead. At the Swiss conference is where the $750 billion figure came out. We heard today $400 billion. This is going to be a huge undertaking, but we need to be ready. And the United States has an opportunity here with the Exim Bank, with Development Finance Corporation, DFC, as I talked about, with our State Department and Commerce Department and all of our entities coming together now to be prepared so that when there is that opportunity to go beyond restoration and reconstruction, that we are ready. Bob made a really good point. It took so long for the Marshall Plan to be put in place that people literally were starving in Europe. And we can't allow a vacuum to occur here. By the way, this vacuum would be filled immediately by other countries, China included, and by other actors, and the United States, the Europeans, Japanese, and others who have played a role here in ensuring that Ukraine can survive through this very difficult period ought to be the ones to step up on reconstruction and restoration next steps. So I think that's incredibly important to get the private sector involvement. There's some private sector folks here today, I know, who are interested and eager to be helpful. And I appreciate the fact, again, that the Ukrainians have this incredible sophistication to be able to work with the best ideas from around the world and implement them. There is an entity in Ukraine now. I'd like Natalie to talk more about it later. I'm going to ask her a question, but is that okay? Am I allowed to ask questions later? And it's basically an agency for reconstruction, and it's being headed by a very senior member of government, and so they're getting ready, and that's good because there needs to be a central point. I think Bob made that point well with regard to how we need to take all these different entities, and the G7 is important because it brings in Japan and Canada and others who would like to be involved as well. I guess the final point that I'll make is related to my experience in the U.S. Congress and what's needed to continue to have U.S. assistance to Ukraine beyond this war. It's hard enough right now, as you know, to garner the support from both parties and the American people to keep this war effort going. I think it's incredibly important, as I said earlier, and I think we should be doing even more in terms of providing the weapons that the Ukrainians have been asking for to be able not just to not lose the war, but to be able to win this war. But as we move into reconstruction, the dollars will be big, and it'll be necessary for us to, I think, make a couple of points to the U.S. Congress and to the American people. One is that the Europeans are going to step up. And as you know, the United States has provided the bulk of the help in terms of the military side. The Europeans are now stepping up more on the economic side. That's appropriate. They have obviously a strong interest in this. They are interested in having Ukraine join the EU. Ukraine is very interested in that, so it all makes sense that some of this reconstruction aid does come from Europe in significant ways, and in part to be able to help Ukraine meet the metrics to be able to join the European Union. Bob made the point that as a national security matter, that's also incredibly important. We talk a lot about NATO. That may be a little while off, although I would support it. But accession to the European Union is incredibly important to integrate a country that has made a decision in 2014 to turn to the West, to turn to democracy and free markets, to turn to freedom. And that, I think, puts the Europeans in a unique position here with reconstruction. So I think that's important to understand from a U.S. perspective and to encourage that the Congress move forward, in concert with the Europeans, again, Japanese, Canadians, and others from around the world who want to help, but that the Europeans are viewed as taking a significant role. And then finally is this issue of accountability. I would argue, and Matt's very eloquent on this point, that already what is happening in terms of ensuring that the federal tax dollar is being spent wisely is unprecedented. And I say that because there are a number of actions that have taken place. One is every time we've appropriated funding for Ukraine, we have put reporting language in that requires the kind of accountability we normally would not see with regard to our foreign aid. By the way, it'd be great to have that kind of accountability on our own domestic spending, say our spending on COVID, which we did not have. But second, there is in Ukraine today a U.S. company, Deloitte, embedded in the Department of Finance that Natalie ran at one point, and we're paying for it. The Ukrainians are totally bought in. They're doing reports and audits. They're keeping up with every dollar that's going to the government in terms of the government aid. Humanitarian aid, as you know, is being run through the World Bank, where they have their own accountability systems in place that are working quite effectively. And one of the points that has not been made clearly enough, I think, is that the IGs, and this is State Department, DOD, AID, IGs, are working in concert and together. They're in Ukraine a lot, I know that. I've spoken to them as they come back. They're issuing reports. They are ensuring that as inspectors general, that they're doing their job. And that's really important. Again, it would have been nice to have had that kind of due diligence with regard to some of the spending with regard to COVID in this country. We do see it now. So I would argue that already there's a lot of accountability. But going forward, I think for the private sector, they need to know there's going to be transparency. They need to know there's going to be the ability to have a fair bidding process. They need to know that there is going to be an investment environment that is welcoming, and that's essential to moving forward. It's also essential, I think, for the U.S. Congress to understand that as we're providing additional funding, that there will be those kinds of measures in place. So with that, again, I thank AEI and Cornell for taking this interest and helping to maybe organize us on this side of the pond a little bit better to be able to be effective on day one as we move from restoration to reconstruction.
Thank you, Senator. Before we go to Matthew, I do want to, some of us are brushing up on our Marshall Plan history as a result of these current events. And I knew that the Marshall Plan occurred, and I knew that it was generally viewed as a good thing. But I didn't realize it took 3 full years after the end of the Second World War for the Marshall Plan to really engage. And meanwhile, Europe was destroyed by the war in Germany and Belgium and so forth, and people were suffering as a result of that delay. So I think your point is very well taken, Senator, that we want to think about these institutions and structures in the United States and elsewhere to get, so we don't have that delay. And of course, Ukraine is doing an admirable job that I think is a point of national pride to reconstruct its infrastructure right now as we speak. And for me as an infrastructure guy, that's great. So thank you for those remarks. Matthew, I'm turning the podium over to you.
So thank you, Rick. Thank you to AEI, the Cornell Program on Infrastructure Policy, and my dear friends at the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council for hosting and organizing this event. And I'm indeed honored to be on this panel with such accomplished leaders who have such a track record and histories of helping to solve critical national security and global economic issues. And I can assure you I'm not standing as a reflection of my relative importance on this panel. It's just more comfortable for me to speak when I'm standing. So my role is to discuss the challenges that corruption will pose during Ukraine's post-conflict restoration and reconstruction of infrastructure. And as you know, there are multiple fora in the United States and Europe which are defining corruption in Ukraine as a fundamental obstacle. So let me start with the following proposition. The intense and often narrow focus on corruption in Ukraine is limiting the United States, European Union, other international stakeholders in their respective approaches to strategies for financing reconstruction. Ukraine's foreign allies and international stakeholders should broaden their focus to include 2 important considerations. The first is that Russia's corruption is a root cause of the war and will remain a central problem. So Russia's decision to attack a sovereign nation in the 21st century in the middle of Europe was caused in part by a systemic level of corruption that drives Russia towards aggression, towards not only Ukraine, but against the international rules-based order and against democracy itself. So Russia's war is not only a war over Ukraine's territory, its independence, its sovereign right to exist, it is also a reflection of a growing conflict between rival economic and legal systems. Second, in the face of this, Ukraine has a strong track record of results in economic and anti-corruption reform, and this track record is an asset. It provides social capital that will help the nation both rebuild and win the peace. So let me put a little bit of historical context around this proposition because I believe it's important. Putin's February 2022 decision to expand Russia's military invasion of Ukraine can be traced directly to Ukraine's revolution of dignity in 2014, known as the Maidan. And as you know, the Maidan was a response to then President Yanukovych's sudden reversal of Ukraine's policy to accede to the European Union, the largest trading bloc in the Union and in the world. So the Maidan essentially challenged Putin's personal authority and autocratic rule over Russia. But more fundamentally, it was a direct threat to the way Russia was organizing its economic growth and expansion. The Maidan was a revolution over the right of citizen entrepreneurs to grow small business on a level playing field supported by an international rules-based system. Following the Maidan, Ukraine began to shape a new economy driven by private sector based on a rule of law. Ukraine was becoming a sovereign, competitive, prosperous, and innovative economy right on Russia's border. By contrast, under Putin, shaped by both feudal and Soviet traditions, Russia was moving decidedly towards oligarchic capitalism. And though Russia acceded to the World Trade Organization in 2012, it was not, in fact, prepared to join in and compete on the international rules-based system. Instead, Russia's economy was increasingly being shaped by an entirely different force, which I called the iron law of oligarchy, which is a system under which public officials and sophisticated networks control state institutions and assets and dictate law enforcement for their own financial benefit. So following the iron law of oligarchy, Russia was expanding, trying to expand and operate transnationally by building crony networks and local economies. They began to push oligarchic capitalism as an alternative to democratic governance, free markets, and they began to fight the US-led international global trading system and markets based on the rule of law. Under these conditions, I believe that Putin viewed Ukraine's determination to join the European Union as the economic equivalent of joining NATO. So the law itself has become a strategic battleground. What many now call lawfare is in effect a battle between the rule of law and the iron law of oligarchy. And as Ukraine began to win key battles in this, with Russia in lawfare, tragically, Russia turned from lawfare to a hot war. And so how does this economic dimension that each of the speakers here has addressed so eloquently inform the diagnostics of international approaches to financing of infrastructure reconstruction? To level set, the risk of corruption in Ukraine is real. And I would argue that the most sort of important challenge and risk is that corruption could lead to social fracturing, and that if we do not control for local and globalized corruption, it could lead to social fracturing in Ukraine during the war. And so I think to meet these challenges, the international community has to rethink its narrow focus on corruption and instead focus on 4 broadening principles. First, donors should be ready to build upon the institutional and legal foundation that Ukraine laid in the post-Maidan period for both preventing and punishing corruption. This includes the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, the Anti-Corruption Court. It includes an agency devoted to corruption prevention. These institutional efforts have also taken place against broader economic reforms that have focused on deregulation, banking sector reform, reform of governance of state-owned enterprises. On top of that, Ukraine has made great strides in decentralizing governance, and that has also had a healthy effect on reducing corruption because it reduces the concentration of power in Kiev. Under the dynamic leadership of the Ministry of Digital Transformation, Ukraine is creating platforms for expediting delivery of public services and reducing corruption. Local software engineers in Ukraine created the e-procurement platform known as Prozoro, which has served the nation very well by saving billions of dollars during the procurement competition process. And so all of these reforms and institutions need to be strengthened. At the outset of Reconstruction, these should be front-loaded. We should focus on getting those institutions even stronger than they are today. A second principle is that Reconstruction can be built on one of Ukraine's singular strengths, which is its dynamic and vibrant civil society. More than 20 Ukrainian organizations have already formed a group that's working on open government and transparency and accountability. They're tracing aid through the entire chain from the moment of design all the way to the moment of delivery. It's called the RISE Coalition, and they are already working with a lot of international donors. Third, international assistance should be geared to help build the non-state entrepreneurial sector of Ukraine. So while Ukraine under President Zelensky started reforms devoted to de-oligarchization of Ukraine. The effort was, I think, stalled a bit by the war. It didn't meet its initial promise, and it will be particularly important to continue those reforms because as huge amounts of aid come into Ukraine, there will be a tendency for new oligarchic networks consisting of both local and international oligarchs to form around those huge budgets and try to take control of them. So we need for assistance to be continually to focus on leveraging the local entrepreneur community, the engineering talent, the human capital that's in the country. A fourth and final principle is that, and the speakers have mentioned this, the reconstruction effort should and can be Ukrainian-owned and Ukrainian-led. And there are already signs that this is underway. Ukraine, in just this past January, created a new agency devoted to restoration and infrastructure development. They are a multi-agency donor platform within the government of Ukraine that is intended to platform the best ideas from within, the demand signals from within Ukraine, and communicate them to the foreign donor audience. And that will go a long way, I think, to helping Ukraine be the lead in the prioritizing this. They just signed an MOU last week with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, in which they promised to share information and take steps to prevent corruption. So I think, in conclusion, winning the peace in Ukraine will be extremely challenging. It will require cementing a new social contract in which governance is based on zero tolerance of corruption and citizen entrepreneur leadership and participation at all levels. Ukraine and its foreign allies and international stakeholders are up to this task. They can meet the challenge by front-loading the strengthening of Ukraine's anti-corruption architecture, economic competitiveness, and innovation, e-governance, and digital tools. They can invest in the human capital provided by citizen entrepreneurs and resilient civil society. And they can strengthen those elements of the economy driven by private sector entrepreneurship and innovation and based on the rule of law. In the process, they can leverage Ukraine's considerable wealth of social capital to maximize the impact of financial contributions to restoration and reconstruction of Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Terrific. Thanks for all the remarks. I'm sure that people have a lot of comments and questions for our distinguished panelists today. They'll come from three sources. One will be people here in the room. The second will be our pretty extensive remote audience. Today will be delivering questions via tablet, and the third will be my head up here. So Rob, well, Bob, I think I have a question for you from the remote people, and I would like to run it by you. It says, given the estimates, which likely is an underestimate, of the proposed budget for the Ukraine reconstruction issue, what % of the total estimate is Russia likely to be obligated for in negotiations, or is to your Washington Post op-ed point?
So I'd divide this question into two parts. One, some of the numbers that we've seen for reconstruction, I think are going to have to be tested and scrutinized more closely. I mean, Natalie, what is the size of the GDP of Ukraine?
Today, after a 35% drop, it's closer to 100 billion.
Okay.
Over 100
So,
billion.
but I'm just but let's say it's 150 billion.
Yeah.
Okay. If you look at reconstruction efforts, including again, Marshall Plan analogy gives some connections, some not. 3 or 4 times GDP would be a rather large sum. Okay. The Marshall Plan was, I don't know, what, 4 or 5 or 6% of GDP. Mm-hmm. So all I'm suggesting on that one is that, as kind of Natalie and I both suggested, let's take this step by step, okay? So let's make sure we get through the survival and make sure there's the sums so that Ukrainian society and economy can operate. Let's focus on the fast recovery needs. And then let's think about the longer term, which is going to be a combination of sort of public and private. So I wouldn't get too hung up on whether it's the 400 billion, 300 billion, 500, 600, 700 billion. And I partly say that because this would just scare the living daylights. We still need to have a political coalition and support here, right? And again, Rob can speak to this more, but his comments even reflected this. You've got people in the Congress who, you got people in the Congress who are sort of saying, look, why are we in this fight? Leading Republicans take that view and running for president. You've got other people that say, okay, we should focus on the military, not the economics. Senator Cotton has said this. I think you're going to need to do both, but we need to keep these within some rational range here so as to try to maintain the political coalition that's going to have to run for a while. Now that takes you to the second point. The reason I've been focusing on the $300 billion is that, well, that's not a bad place to start, whatever the amount is, right? And in terms of, there's a question about how hard it is to identify where those funds are. Without giving the exact sources, some people I know from kind of the IMF would say we've kind of identified maybe 2/3 of it. A lot of it's not in the US, it's kind of in European countries. The good news was a statement of the European Council started the identification process for people to report where it is. That's an important step to be undertaking sort of right now. Then there's the question of being able to access it. And in fact, there was a person associated with AEI that was focusing on, oh, you shouldn't go after these funds, but they focus solely on the private sector, the oligarchs' money. I want to put that aside because the oligarchs' money, frankly, is smaller and it's much more legally complex, okay? But so I'm focusing on the state assets. And let me tell you, let me address the questions you normally get into this. Number one, I missed the day in law school that Russia had constitutional rights in the United States as a state, okay? And so this concern that there's a due process right for Russia just won't stand up under constitutional law. Sovereign immunities. Sovereign immunities is a defense against private action. I'm not talking about private action. I'm talking about state action, okay? So third, what I and Zellico and others have been sort of building the argument is that if you go back to statements of international law commissions endorsed by the UN General Assembly 20 years ago, it's not a sanctions concept. It's a notion basically of countermeasures when a country has been seen as taking aggressive war actions. We've now had various findings by UN resolutions. You've had statements by the International Court of Justice. It's pretty well established that you could transfer the funds. So the U.S. isn't taking the funds itself, but transferring it for a trust fund for the sake of Ukraine. Now, I'm not even suggesting that, let's say you could find $200 billion of it. Again, I've had various debates and people say, oh, well, we may only get $200 billion. Well, that's still real money in me. Let's start with $200 billion. Ukraine's not going to spend all that right off the bat. So fine, you have it in a trust fund, and then you try to build the types of systems that we've talked about this. And I'll go one step further. I would like to try to reach some settlement at some point. I don't know, I think that's going to be, in part, as Rob said, events on the battleground, whether it'll look more like Korea in 52, 53, armistice and others. But this doesn't preclude some ability to have some of those funds be used as part of an overall settlement to make it easier for the Ukrainians, or even if Putin accepted the settlement, which I don't think he will, but if he did, then maybe some of the money comes back. But simply as a diplomatic matter as well as an economic matter, you've got this huge variable that we're not using now, and I want to put it in play and think about its support economically, but think about its support sort of diplomatically as well. So again, coming back to your organization of this effort, I think if you think about most of the news stories that you read about Ukraine, understandably, they're the trauma of the battlefront or the society and the social trauma of this. I think it's really important that we push forward these economic issues, including these sovereign assets. And on the legal basis, Canada's already taken parliamentary action to start to proceed with the types of process that I've discussed. You get different debates in Europe. You have the European Council resolution. In my experience, it's critical for the United States to take a leadership role on this. And so far it hasn't. And so I would like it to do so.
Bob, your comments just gave me a great thought, but I'm going to hold on because Natalie wants to follow up.
It's always dangerous to disagree with your mentor in life, but I'm going to try. I think that the political difficulty of continuing to provide Ukraine with this level of support, I recognize that exists, as the Senator and Bob both said. But I think we need to focus on the amounts being much larger for that reason. And I'll look at it from my Puerto Rico experience. Puerto Rico as an island is 1/66th the size of Ukraine. A one-day hurricane, Hurricane Maria, caused anywhere between $80 and $100 billion of damage to that island. How would we expect that a war of 10 years would cost anything but much, much more? And so I think if you take that into account and the lagging perhaps political active support, we need to get our political class to understand that this is not a small amount of money, that this is going to require long-term commitment. If rebuilding New Orleans took 15 years after Hurricane Katrina and rebuilding Puerto Rico is supposed to take 10, might take 20, we're talking about decades. And I know Ukrainians hate to hear that. They want to rebuild it tomorrow. But this is going to take decades. So this amount of money is large. I'm going to say it's going to push $1 trillion before this is over. It's not all going to come from taxpayer money. It shouldn't come from taxpayer money, the private sector and others. But we need to start getting ourselves ready for the fact that this is much larger than anything we've ever seen in our livelihood. And we have to get ready for those numbers. And I think looking at the damage in different places and how much it cost is going to help us to understand why this is going to be so costly. Again, it's not up to the U.S. taxpayer to pay for it all in any way, shape, or form. But I think we need to start thinking about big numbers and long periods of time.
Senator, you.
So I don't disagree with my colleagues. I want to maybe flesh out the point a little bit I tried to make earlier, which is the economy of Ukraine itself is so critical to this question. And this is not Iraq. This is not Afghanistan. This is a country full of people who are well educated. I don't know. I've heard there's 100,000 software engineers in Ukraine still today, working hard, by the way, many of them on the war effort. But they're ready to go. They have a high-tech workforce. They have the ability to get this economy moving in ways that can. I agree with Natalie. It's going to be quite expensive, and we should prepare ourselves for that. But to get the private sector engaged in an investment environment that's friendly, where the procurement rules make sense, where you have fair bidding, where you have the opportunity to bring Ukrainian citizens in, obviously to do the work, this could really energize this economy. And the connection to the EU and what the EU is requiring anyway in terms of reforms is all positive in terms of a market-based economy. So I'm more positive about what the economy itself can generate to be able to pay for some of this reconstruction.
Right, terrific. We'll go to the room next, madam. You had your hand up? I don't know if we have a roving mic. We do, just hang tough. She's going to, Katrina, oh, okay, Tim, all right. You'll go next, I promise. No, please, you did have your hand. Okay. It's like an auction, the first person.
Yeah, I know, right?
Sold.
Hi, my name's Dave. I run the international weapons sales team for one of the world's biggest defense companies. I know a lot of people in the room because we've been working with Ukraine and kind of leading a coalition of the willing for about 6 or 8 months now on this. And we also sell weapons, and weapons are important. And I like Bob's point that it's not weapons or economy, it's weapons and economy. And I was just on a call this morning where we have 1,000 Ukrainians that we're going to take that labor force that's educated and house them in Bulgaria and help support one of the plants there in Bulgaria, which is a NATO country, to help increase the output of weapons that can go back into Ukraine and can supply the Eastern European market. And what that does is that trains the Ukrainian workforce. It addresses that 40 to 70% unemployment rate that you talk about, and it gives something for them to build towards so that when the strategic situation changes and we can build a plant in Ukraine later, that we have people that are experienced. And so industry's doing that. We're moving out right now. As recently as this morning, I spent most morning on the phone on that. So it's happening. Initially, we were excited about the congressionally approved funds that have been sitting there, kind of the FMF and all that stuff. But honestly, we don't need that. the weapons trade is very vibrant, and so it's more about a production capacity. And so I can take these people and train them. They're an educated workforce. We can produce and we can sell. So industry's out there, and we're ready to engage, and we're happy to do it in lockstep with U.S. government. We've got some, we can help with the policy piece if you need our advice. But the bottom line is we're not waiting around. It's happening. It's been happening for a while. And it's kind of an exciting time to see that. And the output, it helps the unemployment. It helps hasten the transition to NATO calibers, and which helps the supply lines, which helps feed, NATO and applications and all that kind of stuff. And then it wins the war for today. So it's not an either or. But I'll tell you, as an industry guy, it's a nuanced statement when you say Ukraine's at war. I kind of cringe because I say I understand that, but I have to help everybody understand that Ukraine's the size of Texas, and this portion of Ukraine's in a hot war, and this portion is not. And so we are very actively looking at how to decentralize these plants. And so, instead of having one major facility in Western Ukraine, we have a dozen smaller facilities that, quite honestly, are not worth the missile that would have to come that far to kill it. So. But that's a sort of a shaping argument that we have to do with U.S. government all the time. And so, it's not monolithic, it's hard, and so we have to have very nuanced approaches to this. But I'll tell you, industries, we're not sitting around waiting. We're engaged. We're happy to do it too.
So can I make a related point on
More
this
of a
that we haven't
comment,
touched on?
but go ahead, Bob,
but
please.
We all start out talking about this as a war of attrition. Okay?
We did.
And Rob properly identified Zelensky's military demands. I think one thing that the U.S. has not fully recognized is that our industrial base for munitions is much smaller than it was 20 or 10 years ago. And frankly, the Russians have layer after layer of this stuff that they've kept. You can probably find stuff, if not from World War II, almost World War I. They've got artillery and shells of different types. And I think the U.S. has to take a rude awakening about the fact that for us to not only help Ukraine, but us to be positioned in other capacities, we're going to have to vastly expand the capacity we have in terms of our sort of munitions and weapons capabilities. That takes a lot of money. And again, since we're throwing around trillions here, that's investment in capacity. Others can comment. Defense industry is not going to do that if it has to do a big, huge investment and it's only going to run for a year or two. So these are some very big decisions that the DoD budget's going to have to face.
And
Natalie,
you can take your comment one step further. There are companies who are investing in Ukraine on Ukrainian soil and territory today. One multinational just announced a small $20 million investment to rebuild a facility, or build a new facility in Kyiv after having their existing facilities destroyed. Another Irish company, construction materials manufacturer, is building a huge facility in Western Ukraine, just identified the land. So folks are starting to do their due diligence, and they're looking to where they can and where they feel safe doing it. And that there's a Ukrainian agency called Ukraine Invest that I recommend, if you're interested, you get in touch with, that can help with that process.
So terrific. Maybe I'll ask a question I had at this juncture and bring it a little bit back to infrastructure. So in the class that I teach, I always note that the amount of investable capital around the world ready to invest in civil and social infrastructure that is institutional capital, from sovereign wealth funds, public pension funds, private pension funds, university endowments, insurance companies as well, is in the trillions. And it's waiting, and it's patient capital with long-dated liabilities, where they're looking for stable cash flows, and they really are happy to invest in a project where they have a risk-adjusted return on capital. So, and they need a stable institutional environment. And they're just trillions of dollars. So my question would be, what could be done? What would the best way be to proceed for Ukraine to benefit from some of this global capital that is ready to invest in infrastructure from a policy sense? And there's a long tradition in economics of focusing on stable property rights, enforcement of contract, rule of law, social norms, civil society plays into that to guarantee that long-term stable environment. Now, I know we're talking about a war zone here, but we're trying to think forward. Or an alternative would be government guarantees and more shorter term interventions that try to bring that capital in. I realize that's not dichotomous. There are two maybe blended ways of thinking about it. And Bob, maybe one way would be to use that reparations fund money to backstop private infrastructure investment in a fund. That's the idea I had. But do you see the thrust of my question?
Yeah.
Should we focus on creating these? And that gets to your point, Matthew, really well. Senator, you go first, then Matthew.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And what I was trying to say earlier is when I said a welcoming environment, there needs to be a sense, even among these investors, potential investors who have been very bullish on Ukraine. Think of Larry Fink at BlackRock, what he has said publicly, also Jamie Dimon at Chase. So some of the entities that represent a lot of these pension funds you talked about, as an example, and other investors, they're interested. But they're looking for an environment where they know they're going to have some protection against the possibility not just of corruption writ large, but specifically, I talked earlier about procurement rules and understanding that there's going to be a court system that's going to treat them fairly. And again, Matt talked about that. I thought his presentation was very good about some of the institutions that are in place already. Even during the war, these institutions have stayed in place. Natalie can tell you about this, again, from her role as finance minister. So I think it's absolutely there. And the question is, whether there's enough incentive already or whether there needs to be more incentive. That's why I mentioned the Development Finance Corporation or what the World Bank can do, the IMF and others to kind of open it up for more private investment. But I think that's what we overlook sometimes here in Washington. We're just thinking more about, the governmental role and the taxpayer funding, which can be complementary. But I think this is an exciting opportunity.
Matthew.
First of all, I could completely agree that long-term patient money available from institutional investors is an important part of the success and the solution to the rebuild of Ukraine. I think there are great precedents out there for organizing those investors, convening them, and finding ways for them to be creative and convert the conversation from one around, oh my goodness, it's so corrupt, to a conversation around risk mitigation. Because they all have risk mitigation teams, and they can work with Ukrainian counterparts to establish the creative ways, legally, financially, to ensure these investments. There are a great deal of initiatives already on the table from DFC, from MEGA. They are all thinking about ways to ensure against expropriation, corruption risk. So I would urge you to think about ways to do that convening. The state pension funds in America all have people who are trained to think about these issues and do the socially responsible thing with that money, and find ways that includes investing it in public-private projects to do infrastructure in Ukraine and other difficult markets in the world.
Yeah, we're smiling because our program has been approached to help convene these institutional investors on that. But we'll go back to the room, and Ms. over here had a...
Hi, thank you, Melinda Herring, and I'm a director at the Superhuman Center. We're building a first-rate hospital in Lviv, and Natalie Uresco's on our board, so glad to see you.
Small world.
Exactly. Senator Portman, thank you for getting into the details on the unsexy budget support. I think you're right that this doesn't get enough attention. Could you say more about how long you think the U.S. government will be able to continue to hold out on budget support, and what happens after the elections? What happens next year on this category? Thank you. And could you also say more about the 3 different protections that are in place with the auditors in the double booking? Just explain it a little bit more too, please.
Yeah.
I think I'll let someone else answer the political question. I didn't know there was an election coming up. Seriously, I think probably in September, and others may have a different analysis, there will need to be another look at another supplemental appropriation bill. And this would be focused primarily on the military side, but also on humanitarian aid and also on state aid. I think it's about $4.5 billion a month now in terms of state support. Is that about right?
including the recovery, yeah, 4.5.
Yeah, and so it's a significant amount. It adds up. And my question is, how do we prepare ourselves for that moment? And particularly making this point about accountability. When I say accountability, I'm talking about ensuring that those tax dollars are going to the right place. And so the points that I made earlier, and Matt again has talked a lot about this in his work, but there is actually, in my view, an unprecedented amount of oversight, call it oversight, that's already going on. Is it perfect? No, it could probably be improved in some ways, but we've never done this before. Again, with regard to even our domestic spending, much less what we've done globally. So I think there's an argument to be made that the IGs are incredibly active, and they're willing to pull back the curtain and expose any concerns. And I think what the World Bank has done with regard to providing the funding is helpful because the World Bank has its own protocols that are in place to ensure that the money is being spent properly. As an example, humanitarian aid, I think that's important. The fact that Deloitte is there, being paid for by us, but being embraced by the government of Ukraine, I think is very important. My conversations with government officials, including President Zelensky, are that they are absolutely committed to this transparency. Why? I mean, one, he ran a whole campaign on it, named his political party after it, but also that's just in their interest. The last thing they want to have is to give Russia the talking point, which Russia, by the way, through disinformation tries to use already, saying that this money is somehow not being spent properly. The one that's most extraordinary to me is the fact that we don't have any evidence yet, and I may be proven wrong here later today, but any evidence yet of our military weapons having gotten into the wrong hands. This is just extraordinary. This is a hot war. Think of all the Russian equipment that the Ukrainians have managed to find and in many cases repurpose and use. But as an example, the HIMARS, not a single HIMAR has been taken out by Russian artillery, unbelievably, or other kinds of missiles. And the HIMARS are the weapon system that's been most effective in places like Kherson, to be able to launch multiple missiles at the same time and then move quickly. This is just extraordinary that this does not happen. Now, it could happen in the future, but it's because, in part, we are doing very serious, what they call end-use monitoring in the military. So when something comes in, the serial number is recorded. The 101st is now in Poland at the border doing this. The 82nd Airborne was there before. I've visited them. I've seen their processes, watched it. So people need to know that so that as we come on this September date, they know that they shouldn't listen to the siren songs of those who are saying this money is being somehow misallocated or even wasted. I really think we're doing a pretty good job. Could we do better? Sure. And we put reporting language, when I was there, in every bill to ensure that, again, we had unprecedented amount of reporting. But
Matthew wants to respond, then we'll go to this
I'd like to hear
gentleman by the
Matthew on
window.
that.
Matthew, you're next.
No, very quickly, I just wanted, one of the leitmotifs of each of the speakers' presentations today, I think, has been to lift this out of an exclusive focus on the military side of the security equation and focus on the economic side of the security equation. We are in an economic war with Russia and with other countries about the most appropriate way to grow the global economy. And so no matter where you sit in Congress, you should be thinking more, I think, about how Ukraine fits into that war and what kind of global economy the United States should be prepared to lead in the future. What, is it going to be oligarch-based? Is it going to be entrepreneurial-based? Is the simple question. And when you think of it in those terms, then the investment becomes a different type of discussion, it seems to me. And we need to be thinking about new pathways to do business globally, reducing our dependencies on supply chains in China and Russia, and otherwise growing the entrepreneurial models in different parts of the world.
So, gentleman with the yellow tie.
Thank you very much. My name is Anders Åslund. I would like to commend Bob Zelig on his very strong point about the need to confiscate the Central Bank of Russia reserves, and also the excellent article that you, Zelikov and Summers, published. And I would like to draw you out slightly further. As you mentioned, we don't know where this money is. The only information we have is from the Central Bank of Russia, which claims that $39 billion is in the United States. Normally, such funds are held by the New York Fed. The New York Fed has not said anything. What is this? How can you get the New York Fed to talk? And let me at the same time pass on this question to Senator Portman, and in addition to that, another one. Last December, you were part of a unanimous decision to adopt a law on confiscation of frozen assets of Russian oligarchs to be passed on to Ukraine. Unfortunately, the central bank reserves were not part of that. Do you think that it would be possible for the Senate to make a similar decision about the central bank reserves if that would prove necessary, which Bob Zoellick argues is not necessary? Thank you.
Bob, the plot thickens.
So the first, and by the way, for those of you who probably know this, but Anders almost goes back to sort of Natalie's era. Anders wrote the first book about Gorbachev's economic reforms that I read in 1989, and he's been an expert on Ukraine and Russia's economic reforms and turmoil over the course of 30 years. The first way I'd address your question, Anders, would be to legally require banks and all holders of institutions to report, okay? Which I think, I have to double check this with some EU sources. I think the EU Council resolution is sort of doing this, okay? But the US should do the same. Second, as for the facts that I have, as you say, probably a modest amount, but again, you know, I'm no longer in the government like Rob, you know, $39, $40 billion, that still strikes me as a reasonable sum to work with, right? You know, it's not US government money, but it's still significant. But I think probably you'll find more in European sources. There appears to be a number in Belgian accounts. This will be a critical issue on the European front because some European countries, France may be one of them, are sort of concerned about whether taking these sovereign reserves will disrupt their long-term sort of relationships. Others, like your home country, Sweden, seem to be taking a more active role. Sweden is the presidency country during this 6-month period, but I think it's about ready to hand off to Spain. So this is exactly one of the reasons I'm trying to highlight this for a G7 focus to try to sort of dig into, first off, where is the money, who's got it, and then the international legal issues based on it. And again, what I can reference without, I have to be a little careful about sources, is some pretty reliable sources that I have suggest, well, that we could probably identify at least 200 billion of the 300 billion. Okay. Now, the domestic legal question, to help Rob on this, is that, and he may very well know this, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was developing draft legislation to further confirm the authority, I think, that already exists under IEPA. So if they want to endorse it, you know, fine. Senator Risch was doing this with Senator Whitehouse, and I think it was a pretty reasonable bill. There were some similar House efforts. From what I understand, and I want to be a little careful here, this is sort of secondary information, I think Senator Whitehouse got pulled back a little bit by the administration on this. And I think there's a debate within the administration on these sort of exact topics, which is one of the reasons that I wrote the piece with Larry, because I wanted to have sort of a Democrat and at least a one-time Republican sort of have to sort of push the issue. So I think this is very much an issue being joined kind of right now, going forward. And kind of the last point, however, that I want to add to this, because we touched on it, is, you know, particularly for this audience, okay, this is kind of a Euro-Atlantic community, and so we're all sort of have a pretty shared view of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine. Keep in mind the number of countries that have abstained from this effort. So whether it be India, whether it be the Gulf countries in the Middle East, whether others in sub-Saharan Africa. If we want to have a long-term effort and we want to be successful, we have to also figure out ways to bring those countries along in this process. A number of those countries say, look, to be blunt, this is a white man's war. This happens in Africa all the time. We got issues of resilience in terms of COVID. we got issues of energy, we got issues of food issues, so on and so forth. Those are bigger priorities for us, okay? If you're going to have a more successful US and European policy, you at least have to address some of those topics. And here's one small thing to think about in the way of building coalition support. I mentioned the case of the Iraq claims, and by the way, which is a direct precedent. There were like, I think maybe 4 or 5 countries that got benefits out of an Iraqi trust fund. This was after the Gulf War, from Saddam Hussein's aggression. One possibility from what I've talked about would be to have some claims tribunal system for some developing countries, others in Africa, that could demonstrate, not just make a claim, but about the effect of food and energy prices and others on their situation. I'm putting this before this audience because what I'm suggesting here, we've got hard and fast economic issues, we've got economic diplomacy issues, we've got sort of settlement issues, we've got coalition issues. They all have to come together in some integrated fashion, okay? As well as the legal topics that you talked about. And what I've been pushing for is that has not happened with the US and the G7, and it needs to.
Matthew has a follow-up.
Bob, thanks again for writing that great op-ed. It was very timely, and I really was relieved to see it so well framed. I may have been reading a little bit too much into this, but I thought I saw a sentence in there in which you said you thought that by adopting this policy today, the West may be able to force the hand of Russia over the actual conduct of the war. That if they suddenly realize that the costs were going to be this high, this real, that losing $300 billion may do something that the losses that sanctions are not producing in terms of behavior change. I'm just curious, I know that's maybe a stretch.
I think Putin thinks that money is already lost. Okay, I think that money, and so all the more reason. And by the way, part of what we were trying to answer was, there's another counter argument that goes back to World War I and reparations, and is this, sort of, it's like, oh, well, this undermined Weimar. I think it's a totally misapplied analogy. If anything, Ukraine looks more like Weimar to me, which is a struggling democracy trying to come into the international system. And I also distinguish the fact that the reparations after World War I were an ongoing tax, where this is a sort of a one-time sort of wealth hit. And if without getting too wonky on this, if you look at most of the academic literature, it suggests that the statement that came out of Keynes after World War I about the destructiveness of the reparations was far overstated. As a percentage of GDP, Germany was being asked to pay less than France did after the Franco-Prussian War. And as economic historians will know, actually they ended up not paying much of it because the Dawes and Young plans lent them all the money that they then paid back with reparations, some of which came back to the United States. So without getting into all the complexities of it, what I'm trying to sort of emphasize is I don't find the reparations argument to be one that should preclude this. I think Putin has probably thought the money is already gone. But here again, I'll be a little controversial, probably at least in this audience, to say, look, if I'm thinking diplomatically, I want more tools to play with. I want more variables, okay? And if at the end of the day I gave some of the money back to Russia so they would accept a peaceful settlement, well, I'd be willing to live with that, okay? And so, but it depends on the nature of the settlement. Do I think that's very likely? No, but, and I'll add one other one here, because Rob mentioned this, and this is, again, to be provocative for this audience. Look, if Putin whatever piece of paper Putin signs, I wouldn't trust at all, okay? With one exception, the piece of paper he signs in Beijing. If he actually signed an armistice in Beijing, he would have to be very careful about violating that armistice because he can't afford to lose China, okay? So if I could actually engage China with Ukraine, which it hasn't done yet, to try to achieve a peaceful settlement, and maybe even have Ukraine be part of the reconstruction, so should I be automatically be opposed to that? Or might I actually think that that would further Ukraine's security versus Russia? So again, I'm trying to suggest, before we just take automatic lock-in positions, let's consider the long-range strategy here for Ukraine.
I do want to go to another terrific question from the online audience. And Natalie, I don't know if you want to field this or others, but given the current outpouring of humanitarian support for Ukraine, is there also a role for private philanthropy in its reconstruction? What elements of restoration would be most appropriate for this type of support?
Well, I can speak to my own experience, and Melinda mentioned in terms of private philanthropic restoration, we're building a war victim rehabilitation hospital. It's opening in this month sometime, and that is something that theoretically in Ukraine would be done by the Ministry of Health and the government and governments, and this is done purely privately on the basis of private donations, a board of distinguished people across the globe, efforts, yeoman efforts of the team in Ukraine. So I think there is a large role possible for philanthropy, private philanthropy, to build an infrastructure. It may not be bridges and roads, but infrastructure in terms of education. If you go back to the issue of our labor force and 6 to 8 million people having left, the only way to have any chance of attracting them back, especially since so many of them have been surveyed and they're women with children, is that they have assurances of a home, a school, and a job. As long as their children are in schools in Europe, they're not going to pull them back to Ukraine unless they have schools. Today, because of the incremental 4 million people who've moved outside of their original homes, the schools are overwhelmed. The rules of schools today in Ukraine are you can't hold classes on land, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, if you don't have bomb shelter capacity for that number of children. But in Dnipro, in Poltava, in Lviv, the schools are 2, 3, 4 times as subscribed with children because they've moved. They're internally displaced. So building schools, providing for bomb shelters. There are philanthropic efforts being made for rebuilding housing for internally displaced people, for schools. There are groups like Teach for Ukraine that bring fellows into the existing schools to teach the English, the math, the IT. So there are multiple ways of helping philanthropically to rebuild that part of the infrastructure, even though it's not going to be, maybe the traditional roads, bridges perspective.
And that raises an interesting question about, we would think of ADA compliance perhaps in U.S. infrastructure, but there's going to be people with disabilities who come out of this, soldiers missing limbs, and they're going to need wheelchair accessible. I mean, there's a...
So that's the idea of superhumans, just kind of 2-minute advertisement. The idea is we need prosthetic capacity in Ukraine. Whereas typically the people who lost limbs were frontline military personnel. They would have their prosthetic provided to them in Israel, Germany, United States. Today we have children. Those prosthetics need to be changed every growth spurt. We need capacity in Ukraine. Superhuman Center is specifically focusing on prosthetics. Also, prosthetics today are bionic. Frankly speaking, it's not the same old prosthetics of the past. So a big part of that is what you're seeing in philanthropy.
Yeah, and I mean, to put what you said in response to the philanthropic question in infrastructure policy context, I wouldn't think of philanthropy as supporting heavy civil networked infrastructure. I think that's going to have to, but what we call social infrastructure, standalone facilities, schools, hospitals, senior centers, that sort of thing is still infrastructure, but maybe that makes more sense. Senator? Did you
And churches.
And churches.
Churches.
Yes.
No, I mean, I see the American Congress is here. The diaspora is represented here in this room today. It is extraordinary what has happened across the country, and probably everybody in this room has been participating in it. And I thank you, and I know the Ukrainian people are so grateful. That's the first thing you hear when you go to Ukraine. Thank you to America, because the philanthropic effort has been extraordinary. Nobody knows how much, but it's been millions and millions of dollars worth of help, some of which is, supplies, hospital supplies and so on, the kind of work that Natalie's doing. But I think that's a great question that was raised, and I do think there will be an outpouring, a continued outpouring of support and help. And you mentioned hospitals, churches, schools, community centers. I mean, this is all infrastructure, but all of which can be helped through more philanthropic help. In my own home state, we're doing quite a bit of it, including taking people, as you know, at the Cleveland Clinic, Ukrainian soldiers and civilians who've been injured, and helping them. People are opening up their homes, and the amount of equipment, hospital equipment that's gone from Cleveland is extraordinary. So I think that's a great part of the recovery and reconstruction that we perhaps missed earlier.
Matthew, did you want to?
Well, I think the Thank you to Superhumans is the only thing I will add. It's just such a great initiative. Thank you so much for doing what you're doing.
Any other person? Yeah, we're out of time. I guess I'll close. Do you have a very quick question, or fire away?
I'll talk loudly.
Yeah.
Going back to the more mundane topic of like private equity investment.
Yeah.
Key people usually interested in monetary policy as part of their market analysis.
Right.
It sounds like a huge amount of Western currencies is being poured into the Ukrainian economy. Sorry to say I didn't know the Ukrainian currency unit. Who is thinking about that? Who is paying attention to that? What are the monetary and currency, because these deals will have to be transacted in various currencies. Is it all just going to be US and euros, or what does that look like?
The legal currency of Ukraine is the hryvnia. The central bank of Ukraine is actually a very decent monetary policy supervisor and banking regulator. If you go back to when the war started in 2014, our banking system collapsed. It had been poorly regulated, poorly capitalized. We had to shut down about 100 of 300 banks. Today, what you'd find in Ukraine is a very viable and efficient banking sector. No banks are suffering.
Right.
I think the IMF is the second part of the puzzle here, and that IMF program that Bob described that they just entered into, $15.6 billion program, a big piece of that. The major part of it is monetary policy. And much of what has happened to the Ukrainian currency is a result of the timeliness or lack of timeliness of last year EU support to the budget. Promises got made, wages have to be paid, the money didn't come that month, it came 2 months later, 3 months later. The Ukrainian central bank was forced to monetize the deficit and pay those salaries. There was just no choice. That seems to be under control this year. The EU seems to be doing things very regularly every month. It's really changed this year. And with the IMF program, there's not going to be a lot of room for monetizing and or kind of cutting corners. So I think you have a pretty decent monetary system in place today, which we didn't have 10 years ago. The only other thing is a former private equity person. Private equity, you can hedge your currency risk in different ways in your portfolio. A lot of it has to do with having export-related businesses as part of your portfolio, and those export-related businesses are earning euro and dollars. And so there have been private equity successes for the last 15 years. It gets more complicated, certainly over time, if you can't find sufficient export-related businesses. But Ukraine is a major exporter, so that's not as big of a problem as it might be in a place like Moldova, for example.
Just to pick up on this and to underscore a point that Natalie and I touched on early on, the reason we were trying to focus on 3 phases, starting out with survival. The survival one is exactly what she just addressed and you asked about, okay? So last year, frankly, this was slipping out of control. Many people would be unaware, but to the credit of the central bank, pushed the Ministry of Finance to reach this accord, but it only works because the US has been supplying some of this budget support money, and Europe had to use its mechanisms for sort of a loan system as opposed to a grant system to make these commitments. But it's a good example of where, when you think about the economics of Ukraine, you have to think about it in these 3 sort of phases going forward.
We have a hard stop, I'm afraid, but I'd like to really thank our panelists here. This was terrific. Thank you for your presentations and Q&A.